going to come get her.
Okay.
Tell her I'll come down and get her and bring her. Actually, good evening. Good evening. Well, it took us a few minutes to get everyone seated, and I'm actually grateful that it got chilly this evening because we had RSVPs for far more than there are seats in this room, and I always count on rain or cold weather to deter a Californian from showing up. We're a cheerful lot, but we are not sturdy with cold weather. So, thank you very much for coming to what I think will be a very delightful evening. My name is Victoria Sork, and I'm Dean of Life Sciences. So it is my honor to get the event started and move things along. So the division, in case you aren't aware, Life Sciences has several departments, psychology being the largest. Also has a department which has the longest name on campus called Microbiology, Immunology, and Molecular Genetics. A department, Integrative Biology and Physiology. Another department called Molecular Cell and Developmental Biology. And another department, Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And then finally, we have a department called the Institute for Society and Genetics that has a very popular growing major. So we are proud of the fact that our names aren't just names, they describe what we do in the department. So anyway, all of our departments are highly ranked, but in particular, we're very proud of psychology. It's the #1 ranking in clinical psychology. They have several areas ranging from health psychology, experimental, quantitative, developmental. I know I won't keep going because then I'll leave one out, and I will et cetera. But the point is, every one of them is in the top 5 rankings, and overall, it's one of the best departments in the country. And I'm very, very proud of that fact, and I find the responsibility quite daunting because I know that I need to take care of and make sure this department continues its wonderful tradition. And actually, I'm very, very proud to have them in life sciences. So it's particularly appropriate then that the Mautner Lecture, which is the most distinguished lecture series that we do in the sciences, is highlighting a faculty member in the, is highlighting a psychologist who contributes to this discipline. And I think, as I'm not introducing her, but I think you will see also one of the reasons that this department is so thriving is that they do work that crosses disciplines within psychology. It's a very, very integrative approach. And today's speaker, who's not from UCLA, but I think really exemplifies the kind of scholarship that goes on in this department. Before starting, I think it's very, very important to thank the people that make these kind of events happen. And so I do want to honor and recognize the Mautner family. This Mautner Memorial Lecture Series happens every 2 years. It alternates between the Division of Physical and Life Sciences, so it's my honor this year to be the host for the talk. And although my colleague Miguel Garcia Garibay, he was at the reception, he wasn't able to make it tonight, but I want to acknowledge that we really work as a team to make sure that we bring in a high scholar that will stimulate the public, and then also come in and interact with the department so that our faculty and our graduate students and even undergrads have been invited to some of the events. And that's an important part of the Mautner series, is to really stimulate and promote and raise the level of intellectual stimulation. If you think about all of the people that have been in this series, Paul Berg, Feynman, Harold Vamos, Eric Lander, if you look at this list, I won't go down it either, but incredibly distinguished group of speakers, and that's what the Mautner tradition is about. Very, very high caliber speakers and a high caliber interaction, and we're thankful for the Mautners. The family and this tradition, I want to recognize Margaret, who I'm going to bring up and have her say a few words, but Marguerite is here tonight. Her two sons are here, Louis and David Perkins, and her grandson, Kevin Perkins. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and your families. We really appreciate the commitment that you've made to continue this tradition. So I want to tell you, I've met Marguerite and I've known each other for eight years now. The whole time I've been dean, as soon as I got involved, there was a Mautner lecture, and she and I started talking. She cares a great deal that we bring a speaker of high caliber, but one that will really address issues that are of interest to the public. But the other value that Marguerite has is this deep commitment to students and graduate students. She's had it. She's provided fellowships to music students. She's provided support to students of all kinds. But when she really stepped up to take the stewardship of the Mautner lecture after her husband, Leonard, passed, she said, students are very, very important, and I think we ought to do is use this occasion to offer a scholarship. So in the first year, we offered one scholarship, and we've increased it over time. And then she says, we're not giving enough money to students. Can't we do something with the Mautner lecture to kind of cut the costs a little bit so we can generate more money for students? And so we worked on that. How do we retain the quality of the event, but at the same time, just kind of looking here and there where we can do it so we can save money, because she really felt. And in addition, when we didn't initially have enough money, she made additional contributions so that we could give a scholarship award. So that vision of combining a distinguished speaker with the honoring of the next generation, I think it was really Marguerite's inspiration. And so I want to recognize that. And Marguerite, I'm just going to ask you to come forward and make a few remarks.
Takes me a little longer these days.
Want me to hold it?
No, that's fine. It's such a pleasure to be here. It's such a pleasure to be here at this moment. Every 2 years we go through this. Can you hear me? It's familiar. You'll have to excuse me because I just got out of the hospital 2 weeks ago, and I wanted to make it a point to come tonight and tell you how much it means to me to see you here. And I had it all written out, and then I'm such a ham at heart that I just forgot to read it. I used to be much more loquacious. I used to be much more loquacious on this night, but somehow or other, it was denied me. But I do want to thank you for coming. I do hope you enjoy the lecture, and I would look forward to seeing you and speaking to you, and the heck with the paper.
Marguerite, in just recognition of the commitment you have to students, your commitment to this event, and making sure that every time it happened, it lived up to the high standards of Leonard Mautner, we have this special award to recognize your contribution. It says presented to Marguerite S. Perkins Mautner for your generous support of the Mautner Memorial Lecture Series and Graduate Student Awards at UCLA, January 25th, 2017. Marguerite, thank you so much for all you've done. All right, so to just introduce the graduate students who received the award, we've asked her grandson, Kevin Perkins, and Kevin is very, very well aware of the family's loyalty to UCLA and shares in that legacy. At the same time, he is a Berkeley alum, and we appreciate the fact that he feels it's important to give to both universities and believes in the mission of the public. And he and I have had several conversations, and because as he's talked to me about the importance of supporting graduate students and understands the importance, I thought it was particularly appropriate to ask Kevin to represent Marguerite, but present the awards to the students. So Kevin, thank you for coming tonight. And if you want to announce who the students are that won the awards.
Thank you, Dean Sork. And also, I just want to thank all the people that worked really hard to put this lecture together. It involves a lot of different people, but Ellen Beck and Elena Bishop are also really instrumental. And it's a privilege to be here. My grandfather would have been really happy. He passed away several years ago, but he was good friends with Richard Feynman, and he wanted to have this lecture so that the public could have access to scientific speakers, and it's been really a pleasure just to work with everyone at UCLA. I'm really pleased to present the Mautner Graduate Award. The award addresses a vital need, helping UCLA attract the very best and brightest students and provide them with an environment of rich resources to maintain their academic and research excellence. I'm proud to announce this year's Mautner Graduate Award recipients. Winners, if you could please come forward when you hear your name. First, Ann Collins is a fifth-year PhD candidate in behavioral neuroscience whose research focuses on how reward-associated cues motivate reward-seeking behavior. She looks closely at how these processes change during disease states such as addiction. Congratulations. Next is Chloe Boyle, a fifth-year PhD candidate in the health department. Her research examines mechanisms underlying risk and resilience to stress and depression. She looks at this in the context of cancer, as depression is a common behavioral symptom among survivors. Her research intends to inform effective intervention for physical and mental well-being in cancer patients and survivors. Next, Hannah Schachter is a doctoral candidate in the Developmental Psychology Graduate Program. She's a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow. Her research examines how adolescents' peer relationships on and offline affect their psychological, emotional, and social adjustment. And lastly, our fourth award recipient is Amy Zhang, who could not join us for the event today, but who we are also proud to support. Her research uses cutting-edge neuroimaging techniques and novel analytical approaches to understand consciousness and the vegetative state. So Amy, Annie, Chloe, and Hannah, thank you, and again, congratulations. Your work is a phenomenal representation of the academic excellence at UCLA, and we are honored to support you. Thank you.
I promise we are getting to the program, but I appreciate that you're helping us celebrate the accomplishments of our students. So I also want to do is recognize, I want to particularly recognize some of the people who've come here tonight, and I want to thank Carol Block, First Lady of UCLA, for coming here tonight and showing her commitment to academic excellence and community spirit at UCLA. Thank you, Carol, for coming. And I also want to thank Greg Miller, who's the department chair, who is done an amazing job, and he's helped coordinate and make sure a lot of these events. Of course, many other faculty. But he was the one that said, when I asked him to introduce the speaker, he thought it was much more appropriate to have one of the faculty members who has been mentored by today's speaker, knows her research is in the same area, and I really appreciate, Greg, that he would nominate Ted as the person to introduce. I will just say a few remarks about Ted Robles. He's one of our, excellent faculty members in the psychology department. He's an associate professor, and he specializes in two areas, health psychology and clinical psychology, and outstanding researcher and educator in the areas of stress and anxiety, social relationships and marriage, and psychoneuroimmunology. So at least one of those topics might be of interest to you tonight. I'll let you. His research involves understanding how stress and social relationships influence health with a focus on biological processes, which help individuals achieve physiological stability during stressful events. So he received his PhD from The Ohio State University. So please join me in welcoming Ted, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Dean Sork, and welcome everybody. You all know the illustrious company to which Dr. Janice Kiecolt-Glaser now joins. We're talking about Nobel laureates that are listed on your program. And my mentor in graduate school, Dr. Kiecolt-Glaser, I'm very excited to be introducing her as one among those group. After receiving her PhD in psychology at the University of Miami, she started her career at the Department of Psychiatry at The Ohio State University, and she's been there for more than 30 years. She's currently the director of the Ohio State University Institute for Behavioral Medicine Research, which has its own building at Ohio State, which they're very proud of, and holds the S. Robert Davis Chair of Medicine, as well as a title of Distinguished University Professor. Now, Jan is one of a small group of scientists that founded the interdisciplinary field of human psychoneuroimmunology. And because that's so much fun to say, I'm going to just say PNI for short from now on. And this field studies interactions between psychological processes, neural and neuroendocrine mechanisms, and the immune system, and the implications of those interactions for health and well-being. And I just want to briefly highlight her unique role in this field and her exceptional career more broadly. Now, during the early 1980s, Jan and her husband, Ronald Glaser, who was a virologist by training, became interested in the effects of stress on the immune system. And at that time, other scientists who were interested in this question were studying things like spaceflight, like military training, and the closest that they could come to sort of our everyday experience was bereavement. And Jan's unique contributions were focusing on the effects of common, everyday stressful experiences on our immune systems, and that includes things like taking final exams, experiencing loneliness and low social support, and marital separation and divorce. And in the 1990s, and she'll be talking about some of this work, she followed this by being among the first to study the impact of caring for a family member with chronic illness, something that affects many of us. And she helped move the field towards a focus on clinically relevant health outcomes that were linked to stress-related immune changes. In addition to that, Jan also made pioneering contributions to studying close personal relationships and health and the immune system, which she'll talk about in the talk tomorrow night. And she was among the first to test the effects of psychological interventions on the immune system and to recognize the role of inflammation as a key mechanism explaining how stress is related to health, which she'll be talking about tonight as well. Overall, Jan has over 250 publications, and she's successfully competed for dozens of large federally funded grants. And she's received numerous honors and distinctions, which would take me too long to read. We'd be here all night. So I'm just going to focus on two. In 2001, she was elected to the Institute of Medicine at the National Academy of Sciences. And she is also serving a term as a member of the National Advisory Council for Complementary and Integrative Health, which means she's part of a group of people that are directing federal resources to fund complementary and alternative medicine. Finally, in addition to opening new areas of inquiry in P&I and research on stress and mind-body interactions, she's an excellent mentor. Over the past 20 years, her graduate students and her postdocs have gone on to have highly successful research careers. She was my graduate mentor during the early 2000s, and I can truly say that I would not be where I am today here at UCLA as a scientist, writer, and mentor to other students and other postdocs without her own faith, her guidance, and her example. So she'll be talking about how stress kills, the damage, and some remedies. Please join me in finally welcoming Dr. Kiecolt-Glaser as the Mautner Memorial Lecturer. Go get him.
I'm really honored to be here tonight, and I thank you so much for the very kind invitation. How many of you have had experience with a relative or friend with Alzheimer's or another dementia? Wow. Okay. So for very many of you in the room, my story may sound familiar. My husband, Ron Glaser, developed very fast-progressing Alzheimer's disease 3 years ago. Ron was a really smart man, warm, funny, an excellent scientist, a very good administrator, my primary research collaborator, and my best friend. Ron, as people who knew him, was never at a loss for words. His speech became garbled and made very little sense. He became unable to understand most of what was said to him. Ron had always taken great pride in his appearance. He became unable to dress himself, to bathe, to shave, to brush his teeth without help. Ron had a truly exceptional directional sense that I so envied. He could drive somewhere new, learn his way there, and then he could get back there a year or two later because he would remember landmarks. He became unable to find his way around our house, where we'd lived for 12 years. About a year ago, I was sitting watching television with him. I had my arm around him. We were cuddling. He turned to me and he asked, "Who are you?" So what I'm going to talk about today, in part, is some research that we've done on caregiving and its health effects. It's a very important and interesting way to talk about the effects of chronic stress. And what I hope you'll take home from this talk is a better appreciation for what stress can do in your life and some ways you may be able to combat it as well. When we first started the work, it was started because I got a call from Dr. Enid Light at the National Institutes of Health. Enid had seen some work we were doing with medical students, a series of studies where we were showing there a variety of immune changes during exams. And Enid said, "You should be studying caregivers." Well, I literally knew nothing in 1988 about caregiving when Enid called. It was a foreign concept to me. But as she described some of the issues, I could see why it was an important and interesting question. When we think about stress, if you think about the stresses in your life, think about things that are unpredictable, that are uncontrollable, and that involve loss. Any of those, or all of them, make for a nasty package. And caregiving involves all of those. So it seemed like an interesting idea, and that call basically set us on a trajectory for one of our major research paths for the next 20 years. One of the first things we struggled with was, how do we look at the health-relevant consequences of caregiving? We'd been able to show in a lot of ways that there were a lot of different facets of the immune response that changed when people were under stress with our medical students, but we didn't know what that meant for health. So one of the things that Ron suggested was we should look at vaccine responses, because you can give everybody a vaccine, you're giving them something useful, and you're able to look at how their immune system can actually respond to that very standardized dose of something useful. So our first study involved caregivers. Our first vaccine study was caregivers, spouses who are caregiving for a spouse with Alzheimer's, and their very well-matched age mates. And we gave them the influenza vaccine. And what you see here is that clearly our caregivers in blue were substantially less able to mount a fourfold antibody response to respond to the vaccine than their very well-matched counterparts without caregiving responsibilities in red. But that was only part of the story. Because when we looked at people who were 71 or older, what we see is there was a real difference in terms of age. That aging magnifies the effect of stress on the immune response. So that the older we are, the more stress matters and the greater the toll it takes. And it becomes a really important issue. And it wasn't just the influenza vaccine. This was another study with the pneumococcal pneumonia vaccine. This is our line with our current caregivers. We had former caregivers and our non-caregiving group up here. Everybody could mount an effective antibody response, but caregivers could not maintain the protective antibody response. So these studies are important because they tell us that, in fact, this is a nice proxy for infectious illness. We're giving everybody something useful, and that we can see how they can respond. Now, if you're not a caregiver and you're not older and you're thinking this doesn't apply to you, one of our earlier studies with medical students involved the hepatitis B vaccine. We were able to give it following the exact protocol that was recommended, and we looked at how long it took the students to develop a protective antibody response. Students who were more stressed and more anxious took up to a month longer to develop that protective response. So that, in fact, it's not protection. The protection is not the same when people are stressed. When people talk about, well, I got the flu vaccine, but it didn't seem to be effective, it could be that part of what's going on was, as we get older, we may not be able to respond as readily, especially if we're under stress. So if you got a flu vaccine this year, I want you to think back to the day you got the vaccine, if you can remember, your emotional temperature on the day. And it might tell you something about how long it took you to develop a response, and if, in effect, you did. Well, we wanted to look at other health-relevant outcomes, and Phil Maruca, who was a member of our group at the time, he's now Dean of Dentistry at Oregon, said, wound healing would be really interesting because the immune system is really important for wound healing. Well, I thought that sounded like a great idea, so I spent weeks going through a lot of literature trying to find a good surgical model for wound healing. I talked to surgeons. I couldn't find anything because the problem is with surgery, surgeons have a really unfortunate habit of closing wounds after surgery. And we wanted to look at wound closure. So there was only one reasonable thing to do to answer an important scientific question. We began wounding people. What we did was create a pencil eraser-sized wound on the arm with a local anesthetic. I myself was wounded twice as we were getting this together. It's not a big deal, though people wince when I talk about this. And we were really interested in how much stress would actually affect healing of wounds. And the effects turned out to be much larger than we anticipated. It took our caregivers 24% longer to heal exactly the same small standardized wound as our very well-matched non-caregivers. And caregivers also reported greater pain. And that's one of the themes that's come out in the literature since, that when we're stressed, the same stimulus will feel more painful when we're stressed. So again, you may be thinking, well, you know, I'm not a caregiver, I'm not older, this doesn't actually apply. Well, Phil was a periodontist, and he said we should really study oral wounds because they heal so much faster, they're easier to deal with. So he recruited dental students for this study, and he placed a wound on their hard palate. So touch your tongue to the roof of your mouth, either side. So he placed one wound at the end of summer vacation, and the second wound 3 days before the first big exam of the term. And you know, I did not volunteer for this study, but the students actually were reporting little or no pain. One of the first times I talked about that, someone came up to me afterwards and they said, come on, these are dental students. Do you really think they're going to tell you about dental pain being a problem? In fact, the effects were much larger than we'd even seen with caregivers. And it's a stronger design because each person is acting as his or her own control. So you see here data for each of our students, their vacation wound healing time and their exam time. Some students took twice as long to heal exactly the same wound following exams as they had after summer vacation. Stress has really sizable effects on wound healing. Subsequent studies that I've seen in the surgical literature, people are now looking at how stress interferes with recovery from surgery, and how several people are looking at how de-stressing interventions may be useful in terms of preparation for surgery. Well, we thought we were really cool because we had the first published experimental demonstration on wound healing. And then George Crosis, who used to be at the NIH, showed me this quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a surgeon during the American Civil War. And it's a particularly sobering quote. The same wound received in battle will do well in the soldiers that have beaten, that would prove fatal in those that have just been defeated. So clinically, he was recognizing the effects we were studying long before we were actually studying them. Well, infection and trauma, infection and wounds or other kinds of trauma, trigger the inflammatory response. And that's really important. If you're wounded or you're infected, you need to have an inflammatory response because that's part of what helps recovery. What you don't want is a prolonged inflammatory response. It's chronic and persistent. It's been a big buzz in the medical literature in the past couple of decades that more and more we're looking at all the different disorders and diseases that are linked to inflammation. Think in your own family about how many of those diseases or disorders are represented among your own family. It's a rare family that wouldn't have some of those. And they become more and more important over time. The older we are, the greater the risk. Well, when I'm invited to a distinguished lecture like this, and I'm so honored by it, I really wanted to impress people by quoting learned sources and really impressing you with my knowledge. I am quoting a toothpaste ad here. Probably 10 years ago, I was talking with a periodontist, and I was saying, there's this literature on periodontal disease and cardiovascular disease, and I don't understand why there's a connection here. She looked at me as if I were more than slightly dense, and she said, well, look at it this way. If you have periodontal disease, you have a fist-sized wound in your mouth. It's a source of infection. It's not healing. That's why there's this effect. So when you go home tonight and you think about, do you really want to floss and brush because you're tired? I just want you to remember that fist-sized wound. But those minor, what seemingly minor chronic infections or other things, in fact are important because they are a source of inflammation. And that's why it matters that those kinds of things that seem trivial, and I put that in quotes, can actually have longer-term health effects. So we can go straight down from stress and depression to immune dysregulation to an enhanced risk of infection, prolonged infections, and delayed wound healing to increased inflammation. But unfortunately, there's another path as well. What's clear now, and began to be shown back in the 1990s, was that stress and depression can themselves promote inflammation. Work done by Michael Mays, Mike Irwin here at UCLA, and others have shown that clinical depression clearly is associated with heightened inflammation. But then some epidemiologists began showing that it didn't have to be clinical depression, it could simply be depressive symptoms. I'll tell you a little about caregiving and inflammation, and I'll show you a little about acute stresses and inflammation as well. So what I'm saying is we can go straight down the line that I was saying, or you can just go directly from stress and depression to inflammation. This is work done with Chris Fagundes, who was a postdoc in my lab. He's now at Rice and MD Anderson. And we're looking here at a laboratory stressor. The stressor is one that's used a lot in psychological research, and it's really a lovely thing to do to people in the laboratory. You bring in a person, and you tell them in advance they're going to be asked to make a short speech. And you have a panel of 2 or 3 people who are sitting there in white coats. And the person is told that they're experts in behavioral observation, and they'll be coding and judging the speech. The person is given 5 minutes to prepare a talk about why they would be the best person for a job, for example, that they've never held. And then they come and they stand in front of the panel and they start talking. And the panel is instructed to sit there stony-faced. So as the person is saying, you know, I'd really be a good manager for this company because I've had a lot of experience in my fraternity. And the panel just sits there. And if they stop talking, one of the panels will say, please continue. After 5 minutes then, the person has said, okay, is told, we would like you to do some mental arithmetic. Count backwards by 13 from 2,225 as rapidly as you can. And every time they make an error, the panel will say, error, the correct response is. So this is a really effective way to stress people very transiently. And we're looking here at people who have higher or lower levels of depressive symptoms. And what we see is in terms of, this is IL-6, it's an important inflammatory marker, that's all you need to know about it. When people had higher levels of depressive symptoms, they went up higher and stayed up, more than people with lower levels. So part of the idea is when people are already under stress or have mild levels of depressive symptoms, they may have an even larger inflammatory response when they're facing other stressors. Well, what happens then with chronic stress? Well, we had 20 years of caregiver research, I mentioned, and that one of the things we looked at then was what happened over a period of 6 years with our caregivers, looking at inflammation over time in the caregivers. So we had samples that were collected twice a year from both our spousal caregivers and from their age mates who weren't providing care. What you can see here, the solid line, are caregivers, is a much steeper line. Again, this is IL-6, an important inflammatory marker, compared to our non-caregiving controls. In fact, the rate of increase in those caregivers is about 4 times as steep. But one of the reviewers asked a question about what that might mean clinically. As I was cursing the reviewer and spending a lot of time in the library, I found a series of epidemiological studies that I thought were really interesting, where they were talking about the upper quartile was a particular zone of risk for many of the health problems I've been talking about earlier on that slide about inflammation. So if I applied that value to our caregiver sample, our caregivers would cross into that red zone of risk around age 75. Our controls would cross that line sometime, our caregivers would cross around 75, controls would cross around age 90. So a 15-year difference in terms of crossing in a zone of risk, an age-accelerated change in terms of inflammation. Well, one of the questions then would be, what does that mean in terms of caregiver mortality? Do caregivers actually have early mortality? Rich Schultz did a really nice epidemiological study looking at caregivers who were stressed, unstressed, and controls over a period of 4 years. And stressed caregivers had 63% higher mortality. I was really honored when JAMA invited me to write an editorial to accompany this piece where I talked about how some of our data really fit with explaining why, in effect, those changes could be observed. Well, what happens when caregiving ends? If you look at the bereavement literature, losing a spouse is really, really difficult. People, certainly in the first 6 months, are especially troubled, often depressed and anxious. By the end of the first year, people have often begun to be better, and after about 2 years, on average, people are much better. They're not going to be clinically depressed simply because they've been bereaved. So we decided to look at caregivers. So after 2 years, we should be able to see recovery. What we did then was look in our caregiver sample in this same study at people who had been bereaved at least 3 years and compared them to continuous caregivers to look at recovery. So these are the controls, just for reference. These are the former caregivers, the dotted line, and the current caregivers. There's no recovery. And there are several explanations for that, and they're not mutually exclusive. One of the possibilities is biological, that with a longer-term important stress, you may in effect age the immune response. But another is psychological. Our caregivers, and those in other studies, tend to be, even after bereavement, lonelier and have higher levels of depressive symptoms. And that's part of what happens with caregiving. People lose parts of their network. If you're caregiving, you may not have the same opportunities to see friends and family. And caregivers are often reluctant to invite people to their home because the behavior of the spouse is so difficult oftentimes. So people can become more and more isolated. I recall a gentleman in one of our studies who was talking about, he was working half-time in a hardware store. He was a retired engineer. And it actually cost him more to pay for the care for his wife than he earned at the hardware store. But he said basically it gave him a time outside of caregiving, a life outside of caregiving that was so important for him. And so it made a difference for him. And so when we think about stress and we think about the effects of stress and what you can do about it, and this is probably going to be an illegible slide, close personal relationships are one of the most important things that matter. Throughout our work in the lab, the quality of personal relationships has been very much associated with immune function. Lonelier medical students had poorer immune function than their less lonely counterparts. Caregivers who had better support showed less dramatic changes in immune function than those who had less social support. In the line of marital work that Ted mentioned, I'll be talking about tomorrow, unhappy marriages are clearly associated with greater risk. So that our close personal relationships are one of our most vital resources. In terms of anti-stress, it makes such a difference. Excuse me. Oops, I'm going backwards. Yes, I'm going backwards. This is not going to be good. Okay, so what else matters? What do we do when we're stressed? What happens? Well, our sleep goes down. We don't sleep well. I'll talk about that some more. We're less likely to feel like going out and exercising, and we may reach for comfort food. If you smoke, you may smoke more, and alcohol becomes a lot more appealing at times like that. So let's take sleep to start with. This was a really nice study where they're looking at very young and healthy folks who are between the ages of 19 and 34. And they're looking at IL-6 again, that important inflammatory marker. And they're just asking people and just keeping them awake for a couple of 2 hours less of sleep a night. So here they are when they're well rested. Here's the line when for a week they were 2 hours short each night. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been 2 hours short for at least the last 3 nights. And we all are periodically. And that I have to assume that I'm certainly not between the ages of 19 and 34 anymore, regrettably. And so it may become even worse. And so that sleep is one of the really important things that matters in terms of our health. And it matters so much in terms of inflammation. Well, exercise also matters a lot, and for a variety of reasons. Population studies clearly show that people who are more physically fit have lower levels of inflammation. And exercise also reduces depression, which is associated with inflammation, and it also promotes better sleep. So this is one of those kind of messy slides. Basically, what I'm saying here is, so I got interested a while back in what happened when we know diet affects inflammation, we know stress affects inflammation. How about we try looking at them together? So we ran a couple of randomized controlled trials looking at the effect of omega-3 supplementation, because omega-3, the literature in nutrition would say, is anti-inflammatory. I could not show that it lowered inflammation during stress, but I could show it lowered inflammation overall. But I will also give you the caveat that one of the differences here in this study is that we were also selecting people in our mature adult sample here who were sedentary, who were overweight, and so who were most likely to have higher levels of inflammation. Slide from the American Heart Association looking at different kinds of fats and how they talk about the good, the monounsaturated, the polyunsaturated, the bad, the saturated, and then the trans fats that I won't be talking about. I'm just going to tell you here briefly, saturated fats appear to have some pro-inflammatory characteristics. So I've told you that we wounded people, we stressed people. Now we're going to feed them unhealthy food. That meal you see in the corner there is what we were giving people. There are two versions of it. It is scrambled eggs, sausage gravy, and biscuit. And one version of it, both versions have 930 calories and 60 grams of fat. One is high on saturated fat. One is high in high oleic sunflower oil, a relative of olive oil here. And you may be thinking, well, I never would eat something like that. That just really sounds like way too much. But look down here at some of the comparisons, because we were modeling it after fast food options. And what you can see, for example, is Big Mac cheeseburger, medium fries. Sounds good to me. But that's exactly the kind of meal we wanted to give our folks. And we wanted to see what would happen with stress in terms of response to this kind of meal. So this is, again, one of those things where I want you to think about your day yesterday. Did you have things that happened that were stressful? You'll notice that a lot of these are interpersonal stressors, because those tend to be among the most difficult for us. And then when you think about stressors that happened to you yesterday, how long did the event last? How much did you think about it afterwards? How close was the person to you? Because those are the kinds of things that matter for the stresses I'm going to be talking about. So these are scored. There's a dictionary for scoring them, so it's a more objective system of looking at the kinds of events that may be stressful for people. So if I'm really histrionic and I say, I had a bad hair day yesterday, it was terrible, that's not a scorable response. But it does look at interpersonal stressors or other kinds of events. When you think about the stressors you had yesterday or today, think about your diet and your mood in the last 24 hours and how those stressors may have affected you in both counts. So we gave 60 women both meals on 2 different days. They didn't know which meal they were getting for the day. The experimenters didn't know what meal they were getting. And we looked what happened with them metabolically in terms of some inflammatory responses. This is a real busy slide. Let me break it down real fast. CRP, C-reactive protein, is one of the most common inflammatory markers. People ask often, you know, if I want to go to my physician and ask about inflammation, how should I ask? The C-reactive protein, or CRP test, is one of the real standards. When people weren't stressed, what we see is what we would expect here. There's a difference between the high oleic meal, with lower levels of CRP produced in response, and the saturated fat meal. When people had one or more stressors, and this goes up with more stressors, you see that the lines begin to overlap. That the healthy meal begins to look metabolically like the unhealthy meal. Up here we have two adhesion molecules. These are important in terms of atherosclerosis. And you see the same pattern, that basically no stressors, you see the expected difference. You add a stressor on, and people are responding differently to the meal. This is basically saying that ICAM1 and VCAM1, those two of the markers we were looking at, are really important for atherosclerotic disease. And they tell us how, in fact, then why we would care about those markers and why they matter. But that wasn't all we found. There was not a meal-related difference for some of the other effects, but they were just as sobering. When we talk about responses to meals, one of the things we look at is fat oxidation, burning fat. When people had one or more stressors, they burned less fat after the meal. That means they're storing more fat. They also had higher levels of insulin, which is, again, another mechanism for storing fat. And if all that wasn't bad enough, there was actually a change in terms of metabolism. That for people who had one or more stressors, over the next 6 hours that we had them captive in the research center, they burned 104 fewer calories, which isn't much in the course of one day. But if that happened every day to you for a year, it becomes a fairly substantial difference. So we have a mechanism here for both heightening inflammation and storing fat and adding weight related to stress following high-fat meals. I won't go through all this, but basically it's also bad for your triglycerides. You've heard enough about that. And so if you look at some of the other studies from other folks, there's good evidence that depression and stress are associated with weight gain. And they're associated with greater fat. And what we have here is certainly people may eat differently. I do when I'm stressed. But people also may be metabolizing differently and may, in fact, have ways of storing fat that they wouldn't otherwise have when they're stressed. Well, and that brings us back to inflammation, because weight, higher body mass, is one of the biggest ways that we can produce greater inflammation. Up to 30% of IL-6, that important inflammatory marker, is produced by fat tissue. So what we're seeing then is that we have a pathway from stress to depression directly to inflammation, or we can go through weight and eating to get to the same place, the same bad place. So what we can do is we can go straight down here, and when we have increased inflammation, we also have a risk for higher depressive symptoms, because inflammation can, in fact, produce higher levels of depression, fatigue, pain, and cognitive problems. And so we can go directly down. We can go through that route. But we also have a really pernicious feedback loop, that inflammation can then feed back and make us more stressed and depressed, so that it becomes really important to break the cycle as much as possible. So Julie Bauer here and Mike Irwin have done some really elegant work with breast cancer survivors with yoga and Tai Chi. And so I'll just tell you a brief bit about some of what we were doing, but I won't spend a lot of time on it. We were interested in inflammation in our breast cancer survivors because cancer and its treatments can be certainly producing inflammation. And Julie Bauer especially has done some of the really best and most elegant work in terms of fatigue in breast cancer survivors. And up to a third of breast cancer survivors show that they have debilitating fatigue that interferes with their life. And it's in many cases associated with inflammation, though not invariably. So what we wanted to do, we wanted to try a yoga study to see if we could look at reductions in fatigue and inflammation by yoga. And it was also a good strategy because many women who've been through breast cancer may not have the same physical strength and stamina that they had before. So we wanted to try something that would be easier to do. So we had 200 women. They were randomized to either yoga or a waitlist control. The sessions were 12 weeks. The time was 12 weeks, twice a week, 90 minutes a time. And what we found, in fact, was that yoga reduced fatigue and depressive symptoms in our breast cancer survivors, and it was in a dose-response effect. Here's our control group here, the waitlist controls, the women who were doing less in terms of yoga and those who were doing more, dividing them in that way. And there's a dose-response effect. The more the women were practicing, the bigger the positive effects. Vitality is another way to look at fatigue, and these are depressive symptoms. We see the same positive benefits. We also see that in inflammation, we'd see a dose-response effect as well. Across 3 different markers of inflammation, we see differences between women who were in the control group and the women who were practicing yoga related to the intensity with which they practiced. Julie Bauer and Mike have some really nice data, both in terms of yoga, and also Mike has really lovely data in terms of Tai Chi, showing some of the anti-inflammatory benefits. And as a real bonus too, it's the dose-response effect, but I don't show it on the slide, the women who were in the yoga group slept better. So they had extra benefits that may well have been translated into the lower inflammation that we were seeing. Well, people always ask, what were the important ingredients in terms of the yoga study? So yoga involves breath, meditation, and movement. And we can't take it apart. We're like Pavlov's first experiment here. But we do know for some other work in our lab that experienced yoga practitioners had lower inflammatory responses to laboratory stressors. So that part of what yoga and other related disciplines may do is in fact turn down the stress responsiveness, that they may help us become less responsive to acute stressors, and in that way may be particularly beneficial. So if yoga dampens or limits inflammation, it could have actually many, many benefits, although not on a short-term basis. So one of the things I have to do is, since I'm the director of the Institute for Behavioral Medicine Research at Ohio State, I have to give you a very brief, non-commercial message about our institute. The work that I've been describing is made possible because we are such a multidisciplinary institute. I've listed my collaborators on each slide for each study, but I want to give the institute credit too. Just as the excellent group at UCLA, we have our own interdisciplinary group where we're looking at how various disciplines can work together to do the kinds of research I'm describing, where a psychologist like myself can work with immunologists, with experts in nutrition, and a variety of other people to do the kinds of cross-disciplinary research that can be so very important. So one of the things we always talk about is the importance of bench-to-bedside work, translational work. Does the work really matter in the real world? Does what you've done actually translate? And that's been something I've really thought about over the years. A couple of years ago, I went to see my internist for my annual physical. She asked how I was doing, and I said, well, I'm actually rather stressed. She asked why, and I told her about my husband and his Alzheimer's diagnosis. And she said, you need to watch your health. There's this research on stress and caregiving. It was clear she didn't have a clue about my role in any of the research. And I realized at that moment that our research had truly gone from our bench to my bedside and to that of other caregivers. Thank you for your time. Okay.
So we have time for a few questions. Does anyone want to? See, yeah, go ahead.
You mentioned that yoga
Yeah.
and certain exercise
Yeah.
is effective
Yeah.
at lowering the concentration
Yeah.
of the visible signs of stress.
Yeah.
What other ways are there to overcome stress? I mean, I'm an entertainer, so medical clowning has come up as a way to get people through the stress factor. What else works?
You know, there are a lot of things that matter. Part of it, you know, I'd say close personal relationships matter greatly. Being isolated, when we're stressed, we tend to isolate ourselves, and it's a time when we really need support, especially. The things that we do when we're stressed, the sleep, the eating, the exercise, tend to go haywire, and those really matter. We know that exercise matters. We know that a variety of stress reduction techniques, meditation, yoga, and other things are work.